So there's something I've noticed a lot recently when talking about the next generation systems. People do not want to really hear about that right now. They want to hear about what's coming up right now for the console that they bought maybe even years ago at launch with the PlayStation 5 and kind of the Xbox Series, but I do see it come up a lot for Sony specifically. And looking at this now, despite everything kind of lining up as usual, it does make a lot of sense. And I wanted to look at that here today because I think the situation that Sony is coming up on here in a couple of years is going to be quite messy for them. And I'm really interested to see how they manage to navigate this whole thing. So if you guys enjoy the video, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new. Now, I mentioned things have kind of lined up as usual, and that's really just coming down to the length of time for each generation. In fact, 7 years at one point was seen as like an incredible amount of time between a generation starting and ending, or at least a new piece of hardware coming in, since you do have a cross-gen period typically with these systems. It does come down to also how easy it is for backwards compatibility, if at all, like the PS3 to the PS4. There's none, so it wasn't too shocking to see Sony go mostly all in on the PS4 pretty quickly. But going back to even the PS1 to the PS2, the PS2 to the PS3, you're typically looking at that 5, maybe 6 year life cycle for a system. So when you go then from the PS3 to the PS4, and that's 7 years, yeah, it felt like a while. I mean, the 360 definitely felt like a while because that was 8 years. But even then, 7 years is like, wow, this is a pretty long generation for systems that, like when GTA 5 came out, you could tell they were being stretched to their limit. But then we get the PS4, the Xbox One. But the PS4, I mean, just out of the gate, just was rolling. No issues there. The Xbox One really didn't put up much of a fight after the first year, maybe 2 years. It was just off to the races. But still, I mean, that generation was 7 years. And I would say the PS4 specifically really kicked in halfway through the generation, kind of similar to the PS3. But still, here we are now coming up on the 5th year anniversary of the PlayStation 5 launch. Which means if we're going by that 7 year cycle for console releases for Sony, you would look at 2027. And in fact, that's currently what's being reported right now, is that Sony could be targeting holiday 2027 to launch multiple SKUs. And now they have multiple SKUs on the market already. And that's where I think things could get very, very messy for them as they try to work all of this out. Okay, so coming back to the PS5, why are people frustrated to hear about the PS6 currently? Well, if you look at the PS5, there isn't a lot necessarily to define its identity. And I think that's what it keeps coming back to, because I've talked to Ryan about this on ClickR3. Why do you think people look at this current generation as kind of disappointing compared to previous ones? And I do think at this time with the PlayStation 5 and the way that Sony is currently moving almost away from just true exclusives, like indefinite exclusives. I think because they are moving more and more away from that and taking games and putting them, say, on PC, and now we're seeing even on Xbox, and even lending out some of their legacy IPs to be then put on Nintendo's platform by, say, Bandai Namco, or hey, even Guerrilla just saying, hey, here's Lego Horizon on the system. I think when you see that and then you come back and look at the list, which I had to double check, I'm like, is it really that small of PlayStation 5 only games? And I took a look, and yeah, it's pretty small. I mean, some of the games on there, I think a good chunk of the lineup here is even games that aren't out yet. I mean, we haven't even seen footage of Wolverine, and that's on there as a PlayStation 5 only game right now. But you have like Astrobot, Astro's Playroom, that came with the system. Death Stranding 2 on the beach. Let's face it, we know that's going to be on PC, or who knows, Xbox, whatever's after Series, maybe even just on Series in the future. Strangely, still Demon's Souls. I'm a little surprised that never made its way to PC, because it seemed like it was set up for that. And Destruction All-Stars, which if that went to PC, I don't think, if it went to Xbox, I don't think people would really care at all. Otherwise, oh yeah, Saros is coming in the future. Okay. Ghost Yote, Intergalactic. These are games, again, that aren't out yet, and that's making up a good chunk of the list here. So then that comes down to the idea of exclusives and that making a system, making a generation even, You know, like the PS3, people look back on that, especially for exclusives that really got moving in the second half of that generation. Things like Uncharted 2 or God of War 3, these really started to kickstart the generation for Sony, along with, I mean, really cutting the price in half. 600 was insane back then. They got it down to 300 while still keeping things like the Blu-ray playback feature. And that was big because it's a console and a Blu-ray player. So there's added value there. They had to cut out a lot of stuff for the PS2 backwards compatibility and a few other things, especially when it comes to I/O. But at the end of the day, they were selling a game console, and they realized that they maybe went a little too generalized with everything the PS3 could do, which again, now looking back on it, very impressive for its time, but also very costly. So as they went along, they also turned in more and more releases. And then same thing happened with the PS4. While the early days of the PlayStation 4 certainly relied more on the visuals and what it was able to accomplish there with just the stronger system, it wasn't until like the second half when we really started getting some awesome titles that released. I mean, looking back on it, having things like Ghost of Tsushima, God of War 2018, Spider-Man, Last of Us Part 2. I mean, these are high quality releases that really started to pour in. So now here we are with the PlayStation 5, almost 5 years in. And then I tell you about this list of games that, well, in terms of console exclusivity, it's not very good. And that then comes back to the exclusivity discussion, which I see online. This is coming back around to the idea that exclusives in general should just go away completely. And so because I'm a bit older and I remember the days of, the console wars used to be crazy back then. And I remember the console wars of like the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo when there were just shots being taken back and forth from the companies themselves. They were not necessarily friends back then, at least in the public-facing media, we'll say. They had entire pages of ads in magazines, and Sega does what Nintendo don't, and that kind of stuff. So you see that, and then you even get to the point where Sony and Nintendo are clearly going at it, many generations there for a bit. That did really drive a lot of competitive innovation, we'll say. And yes, exclusives, throughout this entire run for gaming, did define generations, and it did define consoles. You think back to some of these systems from even way back in the day, and you remember, oh yeah, I had that system because I could only play this specific game on it. Maybe that game was designed, if you go back to the Genesis, Super Nintendo, blast processing, or a sound chip, like with, the Super Nintendo had an awesome sound chip, stuff like that. Like that, even using cartridge specific features for the Super FX chip, was that those were all impressive things that specifically took advantage of that hardware. And it just kind of feels like now that we've gotten to a point where these systems, a PlayStation or an Xbox, come out and they're so common, like they're so samey. AMD's making the chip for both. Yeah, they'll play around and tweak some of the stuff here and there, but it's starting to become more and more like just honestly, just a PC in a box that has a console environment that limits you basically when it comes to freedom of buying games on different storefronts or just having more options and customization. It's not like back in the day where you had weird bespoke hardware, a motion engine chip. You had, Microsoft showing up with the original Xbox, which was just an off-the-shelf PC just about, where they took parts and just threw them together. But that in and of itself was weird in the console space. So it was kind of like bespoke just by being normal, if that makes sense, especially when you stack it up next to, like the GameCube with the little DVDs and the flipper chipset and stuff. It was just harder to guess exactly how capable each system was. And to me, it made it pretty exciting. Although I also understand for developers, it was kind of a nightmare with things like the cell processor for the PlayStation 3. So I say all that to really try to hammer home the fact that when we went from one generation to the next, back then, it was more obvious that there was a reason to go out and buy the new system. It was more of a generational leap. It was also something where they would show up with some kind of game that was specific to the platform and sold you on the hardware. Yeah, and that was really the big thing there. Now, going into what some are saying is holiday 2027 for a PlayStation 6, I'm trying to figure out what the sell is for Sony, other than it just looks better and it'll run a bit better. People seem pretty content with their PlayStation 5 right now. I know there are games that come out that have issues with frame rate or the resolution has to drop and look kind of blurry. But I think for the most part, people are looking at this going, this feels kind of like an optimization problem because like the hardware keeps getting better and better. But even the PS5 Pro was having a hard time with something like Metal Gear Solid Delta just recently. So it's like, okay, well, if we keep throwing more and more hardware at it and spend more and more money on it, are we sure these games get better? Or will developers and publishers spend more time just trying to make it look more and more lifelike and just sacrifice performance or optimization? Because, I mean, let's face it, graphics sell games. I mean, the marketing is just so much easier when you can show them a screenshot. It's much harder to be like, hey, this thing runs at 120 FPS because you can't really show that in a screenshot. So you couple the fact that people seem happy with the PS5, but also right now, people still seem kind of happy with the PS4. So if you're Sony and you're going to 2027 with the potential for 3 SKUs and PS6, PS6S, which might be kind of like their PS6 handheld that's dockable, but it's just going to be a little box that uses that same Canis chip. So it'll be a bit more powerful than the PS5, but not like that much more powerful. It'll just come in as, I assume, as a lower cost. So you have 3 SKUs there potentially that could be introduced to market all at once. You have the PS5, the PS5 Slim, and the PS5 Pro, and then I want to say the PS4 will be done by then. Man, these companies, developers and publishers, they keep dragging this system along. I mean, hey, credit to the PS4. Clearly, it was a good system in terms of what it's capable of. It's still around, though. And the fact that Call of Duty is coming to the system this year. So it is definitely living into 2026, at least until the next Call of Duty comes out next holiday. And you also have live service games like Fortnite, I mean, thriving on the platform. So it doesn't feel like it's leaving that system anytime soon, which means, yeah, the PS4 is still going to be around most likely in some form in 2027. So you can kind of see how that prolonged cross-gen period that is still alive, and then the PS5 that'll have an even longer cross-gen period, and then the PS6, it's getting kind of crowded. It's getting kind of messy. It's like, okay, Sony's going to support all of these systems. You would have figured that PS4 would have been done, and I kind of feel like they're ready for it to be done at this time, and maybe that's why something like a low-powered PS6S, like the with the Canis chipset that maybe comes in at $400, yeah, again, weaker, but more cost effective. Maybe that's the sell to PS4 owners. Like, hey, you missed that entire generation. Here's a PS6S that's not insanely expensive. And you can kind of get in with that more budget-minded device, kind of like the Xbox Series S. They just have to be cautious about the amount of RAM that they put in that system. Make sure it's enough, because that is something the Xbox Series S ran into this generation. But for me, I think a lot of this will come back to the PlayStation 5 being able to define its generation in the next couple of years. All right. And again, the PS4 in its last couple of years really put out some big games that helped to define its generation. So let's say Ghost of Yote, which is coming up here pretty soon, comes out and is very good. Intergalactic is very good. Marvel's Wolverine is really good. Maybe we hear about the next Sony Santa Monica title, and that like lights up the ratings board on Metacritic. And we have a couple of other surprises. All of a sudden, the PS5 generation comes together at the end, and then you'll have those, I'm sure, to be somewhat resold with PlayStation 6 patches for $10 more. But we'll look back then on the PS5 as, wow, it really got going with these the console level exclusives and stuff that we more defined generations with in the past. But I will say this, going forward, the exclusive narrative stuff around Sony right now, just the way that they're moving and the way that they're talking, it seems like even they realize the market is shifting quite a bit. The fact that half their revenue comes in right now from microtransaction-based games like Fortnite, like Apex Legends, like Call of Duty Warzone, like Genshin Impact, even they understand, wow, the exclusives aren't really the big driving force for revenue like it used to be. People have built digital library, and people play these live service games. I mean, honestly, more than the single player premium purchase games. That's just kind of the world we're in right now, and it's going to be an interesting one to see them navigate. But I do want to ask people, though, when a PS6 gets mentioned, I think the most interesting thing that Sony is allegedly cooking up right now is this PlayStation portable system, the handheld, right? I think the Portal's cool, but it has that limiting factor of it being a streaming only device. I would like to see them take a shot at a successor to the Vita. All right, so I hear that, and then I hear it's dockable, which when it's docked and you remove the power limitations of having to draw from a battery, maybe it is just like a PS5 Plus kind of. That sounds interesting to me, like those like different ideas for the hardware. But also, when you look at the PS6, and I have a PS5 Pro, it's like, okay, what's the jump here? What's the move? Because the PS5 Pro, that'll have to either go away, or the PS6 will have to be more expensive than it. And it's like, how do you figure that out? So for me, I just want to see the games come out from Sony that aren't necessarily live service titles, because I've seen enough of that. But I'd like to see these big time studios that they have turn in some games that get people excited again for the brand, especially heading into the PlayStation 6 reveal, which if we're expecting a holiday 2027 release, that means we're going to hear about the PlayStation 6 in about a year and a half to start off 2027 kind of and get things rolling from there, like February or March, and then just the push of marketing into November, I guess. But let me know what you guys think about this down below, especially when you hear about the PlayStation 6. And I see the frustration in some of the comment sections and people kind of going back and forth about how they'd like this generation to get started. It's been a weird generation, sure. But how do you think Sony could kind of turn around that mindset over the next couple of years for the PlayStation 5 to get people really excited for what could be in store at the PlayStation 6? And that doesn't necessarily have to be games. Maybe you're thinking about things they could do with the hardware or feature set that would work to define the next generation leap. Thanks, guys, for watching, and I'll see you next time.